This meeting is now being recorded.
I trust everyone can see my screen okay. So as introduced, I'm going to spend the next little bit talking about model-based design and how we applied it to the development of our latest artificial pancreas algorithm software. So I want to give a brief introduction on, what we're talking about with, I'll use the term artificial pancreas, although publicly we generally call it a hybrid closed-loop system because artificial pancreas has some connotations about a level of automation that we're really not quite there yet. But nonetheless, it's kind of a general description of what we're doing. So basically what we have is an insulin pump that's body worn, here shown on kind of a belt-worn pump. It's about the size of, a deck of cards. And it's filled with insulin and has the user interface. You can see a little screen on it and some buttons to control the therapy. And as I said, it contains the insulin itself, which it then feeds through an infusion set that it's a thin catheter that's implanted subcutaneously by the patient. And so they receive insulin delivery therapy that way. There's also a continuous glucose monitor. It's basically a blood glucose sensor that is also body worn. It's a small subcutaneous sensor that measures blood glucose about every 5 minutes. It's also calibrated twice a day with an external blood glucose meter. That's like the traditional finger stick where people poke their fingers and take a drop of blood and feed it into a meter, and it communicates with this sensor to calibrate it twice a day. This blood glucose sensor, as I mentioned, transmits its blood glucose information to the pump every 5 minutes. And then also inside the pump is a control algorithm. And that's really that last piece to create what we would call an artificial pancreas system. Traditional therapy with a pump would involve, say, programming what we call a basal rate of insulin, which is basically a constant slow rate of insulin to satisfy your insulin needs throughout the day between meals and overnight. And then there would be a bolus deliveries of insulin that are given at mealtime to deal with carbohydrate intake to reduce your blood sugar after meals. So, and here's what we're able to do with these types of systems. On the left-hand side of the graph below, you see a couple graphs. One here, this big squiggly line, is a kind of a measure of blood glucose for somebody who's on insulin pump therapy, and you see it swinging pretty wildly between, say, 50 and 400. Now, this person is actually not what we consider in very good control, even for someone, without closed-loop control. But this is, this is fairly typical type of control that you'd get for somebody in standard pump therapy. And the bottom, you see the basal rate of insulin, a fairly constant rate. It's on a kind of a program that's based on time of day. And so you see maybe they get, slightly higher rate during the day, maybe a slightly lower rate overnight, and then back to a higher rate during the day. But it's just a repeatable pattern that's programmed into the pump. Then on the right-hand side, you see what happens when they turn on this closed-loop therapy algorithm. And you see immediately the variability of their blood glucose is reduced pretty dramatically, and a large amount of activity now in their basal rates, where before it was a kind of a steady stream of insulin. Now it's highly variable, trying to reduce the variability of the blood glucose response. So that's kind of just a brief overview of our system and what we're doing. And this algorithm that is producing this really variable insulin delivery rate. That's this complex component that's going to be the focus of this presentation and how we actually develop that. So first of all, I kind of in the bio it was mentioned that this was the most complex algorithm that we've probably developed, certainly for therapy control, in Medtronic Diabetes. And it really called for some new thinking. I'll tell just a brief story about how the president of our company decided we needed to launch an algorithm that we had in development for about 12 years, finally launch it into a product. And we had to meet a kind of a critical clinical trial date that was about 8 months away. And I don't know how many people are on the line involved in medical devices and development of these things, but getting something from zero to a clinical trial in 8 months is a very tall order. And especially when you're talking about something that, like I said, is far more complex than anything you've done in the past. In fact, we had recently developed kind of our previous generation of algorithms that we estimated was maybe 1/10 of the complexity of what we had now with this new algorithm, and it took us maybe 3 or 4 months just to write the detailed software specifications from the design, much less actually, integrate it into, the pump software and test it and get it into a trial. So we immediately thought, okay, this is not possible, and so what else can we try? And at that point, I kind of raised my hand and said, well, we can try maybe model-based design. In fact, some of the algorithms that we had were already coded up in a MATLAB and Simulink, and I knew from my past work in aerospace that there were tools that existed that you could actually generate code automatically from these models, and why don't we give this a shot? It took quite a bit of convincing, but ultimately I think the looming deadline of that 8-month to clinical trial really lit a fire under us and gave us that extra motivation to go ahead and try something that at the outset seemed rather risky. And so let's talk about what model-based design is. So at first I'd say it's kind of a visual method. Okay, so generally when you start with any kind of design for an algorithm or anything for that matter, you start with some kind of high-level requirement saying what this thing is supposed to do, the needs it has to meet. And then from there you go into design, and oftentimes you wind up with a cascading set of requirements, from higher level requirements to lower level requirements to very detailed requirements to finally design specifications, all kind of in English language, very readable, but it's oftentimes very difficult to look at all these layers of requirements and then figure out what is this thing actually supposed to do, and how do I know if it's working right? How do I know these requirements are not conflicting or causing some weird, scenarios in behavior or performance? So using a more visual method of getting into these kind of the lower level, not just requirements, but the design, I think is helpful in getting a more general understanding of how this thing works, how the data flows through the system, and what the outcomes may be. As I mentioned, model-based design does not have to be applied to embedded software development, but for this application, it was indeed applied to embedded software development. And the reason I kind of emphasize this point in this presentation is that using model-based design, there are additional tools available to you, like code generation tools, where you can go directly from design to code at the push of a button without having to turn software engineers loose on the designs and try to interpret the designs and turn them into code. So it automates, it has the potential certainly to automate large parts of your development process, which improves speed and efficiency. Some key ideas involved are this notion of what we call executable specifications. So here you see at the bottom these visual design specifications that, in and of themselves, you could put these on paper and say, well, this is our design, and, here's our state machine, and here's our block diagram of our filters and control algorithms, and this is, we think it'll work, and we've done analysis. But when you use the tools that are set up for model-based design, these specifications become executable, and they become executable through simulation and other ways, key ideas. And so it's really actually this notion of simulation that gives, in my opinion, this model-based design its most power. The fact that you can take your specifications, simulate cases, look at different use cases, edge cases, what have you, evaluate the performance, do Monte Carlo analysis, statistical analysis, you can do all kinds of experiments in a simulation environment that you could never, it's just simply impossible, inconceivable, on paper-based requirements flow downs. So with that, I think I want to talk about a little bit about the process of model-based design and how we applied it to well, certainly to our artificial pancreas system, but would be a general process for any kind of algorithm software development. And so let's compare, let's take a look at, say, the traditional process, and it's highly simplified, of course, but generally you start with some high-level requirements. Now we know in practice oftentimes we'll start with design and work into code and say, oh gosh, we need requirements, and then back the high-level requirements out. But ideally, you would start with some kind of high-level requirements for what this algorithm is supposed to do, and then you kind of fall into this design space. And this is the kind of a creative process where scientists and engineers come together and they figure out, well, how do we satisfy these requirements with some algorithm or some system, and it can be kind of an ad hoc process that's driven by based on tools that the engineers have some preference for based on what they did in graduate school or what have you. They throw together some mathematical equations, maybe some simulations and hand calculations, and they come up with a design. However, I note down here that oftentimes the design output is not totally sufficient for formal software development. I mean, you'll have a set of mathematical equations, and you give it to software, and they'll ask 1,000 what-if questions. Well, what if this case? What if this case? What if this case? And then they have to go back and say, well, in this particular instance, you need to maybe shut this path off and do this special equation to deal with that edge case. And so there's some iteration certainly that goes on between the design and the actual development. Well, once the design is kind of solidified, you go into what I would call a design decomposition phase, and that's what I would call a very tedious process of converting, say, these mathematical equations into kind of like English language specifications that a software engineer could actually code against. I think I mentioned earlier in our previous design, this process took like 3 to 4 months to take a mathematical design and transform it into English language requirements that could be coded against. And oftentimes, this type of documentation or this decomposition effort, I would characterize as fairly low value effort. I mean, obviously it drives the design of the software, but I could also argue, like, why don't you just have the software developers just look at the equations, directly and, write the code. Unfortunately, oftentimes software engineers are not trained in that level in the specialized mathematics and that, and so they need things kind of spelled out to them in more granular detail. Also in the design decomposition phase, this is where the first place we start digging into these edge cases that I mentioned earlier, where you kind of go back and forth to try to deal with some of the things that were not thought of at the higher level design process. Then you dump into the software development itself, where they take these kind of low-level requirements that came out of the design decomposition phase and actually turn it into executable software code. They add additional rigor, things that, again, weren't thought of necessarily in the algorithm design space, where there are now, say, numerical issues involved. It's one thing to say, well, if you solve these mathematical equations, you're going to get, the desired output. But what if we can't solve the mathematical equations to infinite precision because we're working on digital machines? So does that, precision error, could that propagate and cause problems? Oh, well, the designer's like, well, we didn't really consider that. So now we have to go back and fine-tune our calculations to make sure if we're robust to precision loss, so that causes some kind of iteration loops as those issues are worked through. And then they finally then work through the problem of the actual software architecture and how do we integrate now this new algorithm into the code base. And then finally at the end of the line is software test. They have to kind of wait until they can't test software until software is actually developed, so they're kind of at the end of the line. And then what they are looking at are they go back to these high-level requirements and these other lower-level requirements, and they write test cases to make sure that the software is doing exactly what the requirements say it should do. They'll also do additional robustness testing where they throw lots of different edge cases at it to literally try to break the software and find where it's fragile, so we can shore up issues that appear. But of course, when software test finds a problem, it requires, going perhaps all the way back to the design, maybe even to the high-level requirements to fix things, and you have to go right back through the process, decompose the new changes, do the software development, and write the code, and then retest. So this loop, or since it's kind of like a waterfall linear method, it can take a long time to execute, and it when you're faced with an 8-month timeline of development, oftentimes it can be impossible to do within the time frames. So let's look at how model-based design works, the methodology. Starts at the same place. You have high-level requirements here at the top, dumping in, and now you go into an algorithm design phase. And now instead of using kind of ad hoc tools, you coalesce around a set of tools that all the parties involved will use. So now at Diabetes, we wound up using the MathWorks tools I mentioned, MATLAB and Simulate. There are other tools that are available for this. I know it has a suite of tools to do this type of work, and there are others as well. But nonetheless, you decide, okay, these are the tools we want to use, modeling, design, simulation. And the designers use it, the software testers are going to use it, and the software developers are going to use it. And so what happens then is the algorithm designers go in, design their algorithms in a very domain-specific way. So if they're working on control systems, they're designing them and Simulink block diagrams, for example. If they're working with state machines, Simulink has a tool for state machine design, okay, that they can design state machines in a very visual way they're comfortable with based on their domain expertise. While they're during the design phase, they can continue to use simulation to continually validate the system performance. So they make a design, they run through simulation, say, okay, we're getting the right performance we want, so let's continue. Or if it's not giving the right performance, they tweak the design. But there's this constant cycle of validation that's going on internal to the design process. Also, the algorithm developers can address these numerical issues immediately up front. In the simulation environment, you can say, well, I know that I only have, say, single precision floating point numbers available to me, or fixed point numbers, or whatever your software constraints are. You can build that into the simulation model so that you can see if there's precision problems or any kind of numerical issues. You'll see that come out during this kind of these validation cycles, and so they can be addressed early. The software test engineers can actually start developing their test cases against the models themselves. They don't have to wait until actual executable software is developed. Because of, if we look ahead a little bit and look at the code generation, when we get to the code generation part, the tools will ensure that the actual software executable will be identical in terms of performance to the design models. So they can start developing their test cases against the models. And again, root out problems early. If they find a problem right away with an edge case, they can talk to the designers and say, we found a problem, and the designers can deal with it right then and there. The software developers, they have a slightly different role now, and their role is they're not so worried now about how am I going to convert these design models into code, because the code generation is going to do that for them. Their problem now becomes, how do I work on the software architecture of our system so that this generated code output will integrate cleanly into the rest of the code base. I have some chart. I think I have a chart later on that kind of addresses this issue, but it sort of separates them from the development process of the algorithms themselves and allows them to focus on integration and architectural issues with the software, which I think is a more valuable place for them to be focused on. And by making good architectural decisions up front, you can separate the work of the algorithm designers from the software developers, because essentially what happens is you get the two groups to identify a clean interface between the algorithm and the rest of the software. And once they agree on that interface, then the software developers can say, well, I can start designing the rest of my code base to provide the data across that interface that we agreed to, and the algorithm designers can say, I can do whatever I want in my box, and as long as I adhere to that interface, it should just drop in and plug right into the code base. So that's the theory. You have all the groups working up front, and then in the design space. And then once the design is done, then you have automated processes to get you into the product. We can automate even the documentation of the software design specifications. Now, at the working level, if people ask me, well, like, what, can you show me something in the design? I would just literally just open up the tool and just show them in, on my computer, where this is done in the design. Now, of course, in a regulated industry, you have to have, design control, documentation and so forth. And so something to basically put into doc control that documents your design and shows all the traceability in basically paper format. And so, fortunately, that can be done automatically using the tools that are provided with these model-based design tools to automatically generate your design documentation for no other reason, for compliance purposes. And then finally, like I said, we have the automatic code generation, which can take the designs and faithfully transform them into executable software code that can be put into the product directly. So this kind of concurrent machine-aided workflow is what provides that rapid acceleration of the whole development process, and without sacrificing quality. I mean, people oftentimes will say, well, if you're speeding things up, quality is necessarily going to suffer. And we found that not to be the case. In fact, we found that we're able to improve quality through automatic code generation by generating error-free code all the time, and by incorporating software tests earlier. Software test was able to generate much more test coverage than we've ever been able to have before, because they had luxury of time. They were involved up front. They were working with the designers directly. So we're actually able to improve quality. So something that you probably would not expect, better speed with better quality. So we talked about simulation and how we can use simulation to continually validate our design performance. And here's kind of a picture of our artificial pancreas system simulation. And this is, for those of you who've seen or worked with Simulink before, you'll recognize, oh, this looks like Simulink, because it is Simulink. Now, it's dressed up nicely, and this is one of the nice advantages of say, a visual-based methodology, is that this is actually a simulation that I can run test cases against. But I can show this to you, and you can immediately see exactly what our system looks like, and basically the big components in the system, and what the main data pathways are through the system. You see an obvious insulin pump that's feeding insulin into a human. The human has a blood glucose that is measured by this blood glucose meter, and also this blood glucose sensor that is then feeding back information into the pump, and we have kind of this closed loop system. So I'll show you in a few minutes actually a simulation test case that is running through the simulation. But for the purposes of, say, our algorithm development, really what we were doing is we were not touching any of the software and these other components, but we were drilling into some control software that was in the pump itself. And so now this pump has lots of other software in it that we didn't want to touch. It had user interface software. It had low level, the driver software for the pump motors and the buttons, and all that stuff. We didn't want to touch that. We just wanted to introduce a new therapy control algorithm embedded into that pump software. So how do we do that? And so basically, here's like a little highly oversimplified picture of our software code base, and you see a bunch of different functionalities that are already coded that we don't want to touch. But we want to incorporate a new piece of software, this algorithm software, into this soup of the rest of the code base. And the way we did that, and I alluded to it earlier, is we agreed with the software developers who were in charge of all this, saying, well, let's figure out what this algorithm software needs, and let's define a clean interface so that if it needs some data from the business logic or from the notification manager or from the delivery manager, let's define what that interface is, when it needs the data, what precision it needs the data in, all the details of that data, and we'll write a special piece of software just to manage that interface. Then the designers can work on the other side of this interface wall and develop their their algorithm software that adheres to this interface. And then the idea is we can rapidly generate, different versions of this algorithm software as the designs improve over time, and drop it directly into the rest of the code base. And as long as once this interface wrapper is developed, it's really like a plug and play type system. You just drop it in and everything just works and you get better therapy. So it's a really nice kind of separation of resources between software development and the algorithm developers. So I think I mentioned earlier that I was going to show you a little bit of the simulations. Here's that simulation I showed you a picture of before. And I'm just going to go ahead and play a little video of it running a test case. So you see I'm going to hit that little play button up there, and it's going to compile and start running. And I'm going to click on a little graph viewer. It's going to show you this thing actually working in faster than real time. And so you see like these lines up here in the second box. That's our, say, a blood glucose trace with the sensor estimate is the yellow line, which doesn't exactly match the blood glucose. And then the third box down, you see the insulin infusion rate, in response to these blood glucose feedback. So you can see a couple features here, like for instance, with simulation, obviously, ideally, we would measure the true blood glucose as blue line perfectly, but in real life, of course, your sensors are not perfect. You have, squiggles and errors and delays, okay, and your system still has to perform to make sure that blue line, that true blood glucose stays within, a reasonable target. So we can run, thousands and thousands of these simulations on different use cases. This particular case is a simple meal, where here's the bolus insulin on the fourth panel down. You see a big spike of insulin coming in. When the user ate, their blood glucose goes up and it's coming down, and all the insulin delivery patterns that are required to keep that blood sugar under control. So we'll run thousands of these cases, analyze the results, oftentimes statistically, and then keep fine-tuning our designs, based on these results. And so what does all this give you? Well, it gives you a big time savings. So you're just mapping, the two processes side by side. You see that we're able to, by pulling all this effort up into the design space, coalescing around these tools and leveraging simulation, we're able to, just bring in the finish line for when we're able to develop products. And in the case of our artificial pancreas development, we were actually able to hit that timeline of that clinical study in 8 months, which just, as we started, we thought would have been impossible using the traditional routes. So one of the areas of pushback when we were trying to, sell the organization on this methodology was, well, you guys, this sounds like some modern technology and not, it's not mature enough for medical devices. By the way, medical devices are, we're in a higher risk category. It's not like a, like a little, something that has no risk to it. There are people's lives on the line if you overdose insulin, and we can't trust it, so forth. And now the reason, I knew about this is in my previous life as an aerospace engineer at NASA, we actually used this technique to design and deploy flight control systems for what it amounted to killer robot airplanes, these UCAVs that we were flying around in 1999 on auto-generated software. And so you actually see in this little summary of the development where we're saying, well, the flight control software was obtained by autocoding the control law block diagrams right from the simulator. So that's basically model-based design in a nutshell. We were doing that 18 years ago. And so it turns out that the tools we were using were not MATLAB and Simulink. We were using a tool called Matrix X, which I don't even know if it's in existence anymore. It turns out that MathWorks bought Matrix X around the year 2000, shortly, right around this time, and the federal government actually filed an antitrust lawsuit against MathWorks because they thought that they would have because of this code generation capability, because they thought that they would own basically all this code generation technology and have a monopoly on it, and the government was already starting to depend on this code generation for some of their advanced defense projects. So they filed an antitrust lawsuit. MathWorks had to then spin off Matrix X again into some kind of independent entity, which I think was picked up by National Instruments, I think. And so I don't even know if it still exists, but MathWorks basically wound up adopting a lot of the technology into their code generation that we were using in this aircraft development. So it's not a newfangled technology. In 1999, admittedly, it was new, but these days it's a fairly mature technology. The other pushback came from our own, actually, frankly, from our own systems engineering groups and quality groups, saying, well, how does this fit into our current development methodology? So we have to create a brand new development methodology that's tailored to this model-based design, and how we don't know how to do that, and is that going to be compliant with the FDA regulations and so forth? And I drew this little diagram. It kind of evokes a V model of development, and I tried to show how actually it maps directly into a kind of that V model development that we use, certainly at Medtronic. I think it's kind of an industry standard for system engineering and product development, where, again, you start with requirements on one end, you have a product at the other end, design at the bottom, and you're verifying, across the V, and then, tracing up the sides of the V, so we have, basically all the pieces are in place to just plug right into our existing development methodologies without really creating anything new. However, I'll note that you notice that all these arrows, these red arrows anyway, seem to point right back to the model or emanate from the model. So the model, this design model, really does become the single point of truth for all development activities, be it requirements and tracing to requirements, or to actual executable software and verifying, against this single source of truth. And so, in conclusion here, we've shown now that this model-based design methodology, and we've shown it just through our own practice and our own development, that we're able to increase the speed of design without sacrificing quality. It's also encouraged this kind of structured concurrent development where you have the testers, the designers, and the software developers working together, defining interfaces, separating activities, so let the software folks work on things that they're good at, let the algorithm designers work on things that they're good at, and then they come together at that interface. It encourages that type of structured development. We've shown that the code generation and this machine-aided testing is able to rapidly reduce software errors by eliminating any kind of coding errors or interpretation errors from design to actual software code, and enabling much more rapid testing and better test coverage that we've been able to get before. Our design models are highly reusable and can eliminate what I would call that low value documentation. So when we go from generation to generation, we have design models, we have a simulation all set up. Oftentimes we're just tweaking one part of our design, adding a new module into an existing design, and the documentation, it basically comes for free. You just at the push of a button, you're able to produce your design documentation for compliance purposes. Everything is also fully traceable. Through the tools, we're able to trace any aspect of the design, any part, any piece of the model, and trace it right up to a requirement in our requirements database, so that we can maintain that. In fact, that traceability, those traceability tags, wind up propagating all the way down into the generated code. So if you wanted traceability from a high-level requirement all the way to a line of code, you can get that too. And and we've proven this success on our own internal development, on our artificial pancreas development. We're continuing now in our future generations on this path, and we're actually working into some of the other subsystems, like those sensor subsystems I showed you in the simulation. We're also now starting to employ these techniques into some of their advanced algorithms. So it's proven to be very successful for us, and it was a difficult journey, but we're happy we went into it. Now we're kind of all in at this point. So that concludes my formal presentation. So I think we have about 15 minutes or so for questions, and which I'm happy to take.
Thanks, Lou. I'd like to open up the floor for any questions. If you have some, please type those into the chat area, and we will address them. So, now we have a question. The question is, well, it's a nice long one. Did you go about validating Simulink Autocoder as tools or just verify the output? If you did validate Simulink Autocoder, what was your approach?
Great question. So initially, I was hoping and I was pushing to just say, look, it doesn't matter the tools we use. We're going to verify the code at the end that it meets our requirements. And so, I mean, in my high-level thinking, it's like it wouldn't matter to me if a room full of monkeys wrote the code. As long as it meets the requirements, it's good. And that argument did not fly with our quality and regulatory folks. So they actually did say we needed to do a tool validation of the MathWorks tools that we're using. And so this was a kind of a fairly concerted parallel effort that we did. And so essentially how we approached it was, first of all, we had to say, well, when you do a tool validation, you have to say, what are the requirements for the tool? What does it need to do? And you don't have to be super granular about it. Just say, well, I want to use the tool to design control algorithms, state machines and block diagrams, and I want to use it to generate software code in the C programming language. And we had maybe 15 or so kind of requirements, high-level requirements for the tool itself. And then what we did is we wrote some procedures, some operating procedures for how we do model-based design. And then we linked those procedures to our high-level requirements. So we said, well, we need the tool to do this, and the reason we need the tool to do this is because this is our operating procedure for how we're going to use the tools. And then finally what we did is then wrote test cases to verify that the tool met the needs. And so in the end, it turned out to be a fairly straightforward process, but it did take us a while to kind of figure out the strategy for how we're going to approach this. But it did not. When all the dust settled, when we finally had our test plan, our strategy written out and our test plans written, it took us like one day to actually do the tool validation testing. But at a high level, again, we had to identify the needs of the tool. We wrote operating procedures for how we're going to use it, and then we wrote test cases to verify that the tool could satisfy our needs.
Thanks, Lou. We got another question. How did you address the issues related to embedded software with your models? Numeric precision, fixed point versus floating point, processor loading and performance, memory usage.
Yeah, so we did a little bit of a kind of a very simple brute force approach, if you will. Actually, there are actually two separate threads to that answer. So let me talk about the fixed point, floating point thing, because that's kind of an interesting story in itself. So up to this point, I mentioned this was like a very sophisticated algorithm that we had developed, and up to this point, our therapy control algorithms were just, programming fixed basal rates or fixed bolus amounts and like almost integer values. And so there was no floating point support in our pump up to that point. And whenever we'd ask the question, the software developer said, "Oh no, our pump hardware can't support it, so stop asking the question." And so, all right, so we started developing our algorithm models using fixed point math, which is it's actually possible to do that. Take floating point simulations and convert it into fixed point math using these model-based design tools. But just dealing with those fixed point issues added, I estimate, about 30% of just development overhead to the process, just dealing with those fixed point, floating point conversion issues for all of our data. And it turned out to be very cumbersome. And so I asked the question again, can we possibly consider using floating point? And this is taking us 30% of the time. And then some higher level directors got wind of this, and they said, well, what can we do? And then as it turned out, when really pressed, the software developers said, well, actually our hardware can handle floating point. We just haven't installed the software library to do it. And so I think they thought the world was going to end if they installed the software library, but they finally did it. And sure enough, it worked fine. And from that point on, we were able to use floating point math. So that was pretty cool. And now what that's also turned out as a benefit is that we're working on our next generation of pump hardware. And one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to make sure we have a floating point coprocessor in there because we're starting to do these types of algorithms. So this is something that maybe we would not have had we not really pressed them on this particular issue. So that was nice. Now, in terms of other types of precision problems or say throughput, another concern was say, can our processors handle the computational load of these algorithms? And that's kind of hard to estimate, and we have like this like multi-threaded operating system running in our pumps, and you kind of play this game of like, well, how much processing load you allocate to each individual thread, and you're constantly balancing these threads. And so I kind of led off the answer saying, well, we did a brute force approach where we just said, well, let's just give them let's just give them the algorithm, plug it in. They had their interface, let's just plug it in and try it. And they tried it, they ran some cases, and it turned out that, yep, we can handle it fine. Maybe we'll give a little more, space in this thread to deal, to give it some margin, but for the most part, it was not a problem. So we never really had to go back and try to do a really serious analysis of, where the computations were getting heavy and bogging down the processors. Now, we may have to do that in the future as our algorithms get even more sophisticated, but so far we've had enough computational overhead to deal with that. That being said, the tools actually do offer what's called code profiling capability, where you can run simulations and look at, basically processor loading as simulations are occurring. And so you can then identify, say, hotspots in the code and then try to figure out how do I, maybe optimize, parts of this computation or, space it out in time or what tricks can I do to kind of, level out these hotspots. We did not have to do that, but the tools do exist to enable that.
Great, thank you. We have another question. How did you validate the simulated human model, and was that important to your strategy?
These are really good questions. So the human model, we are actually working on a validation of that as we speak. So basically what we did is for this first generation system is we developed a human model, and we had internal kind of faith in, all right? And but the FDA did not know about it. We did not even tell the FDA we were using it. We did not get into this detail of the process with them. But we had a degree of confidence, at least for designing for general performance. But then we would run clinical studies to show to the FDA that, yep, our performance actually works in real life. Now, the FDA never asked us, well, how did you get from 0 to clinical study, so much? They just we just took it into a low-risk clinical study, showed that it worked, and it just kept bridging up to higher-risk studies based on previous results. Now, again, behind the scenes, we were actually building our own internal confidence before we put on humans based on these, what you would call unvalidated models that we were working on. We are currently undergoing a much more formal validation of these we call them virtual patient models that we are going to, in fact, in the next few weeks, we're actually going to make a pre-submission to the FDA that's going to include these virtual patient models. So this will be the first time the FDA has actually seen, behind the curtains of what we're doing with the virtual patients, because we're actually trying to now drive a discussion for, like up to this point, everything we did, we needed clinical data because we weren't telling the FDA about our models and they were not validated to their satisfaction anyway. But now we want to say, well, now we've got these validated models. Do we have to run all these clinical studies? Can we take a bigger step and maybe skip a step in the clinical studies because using these validated models, we can show that this is a low risk study. Maybe we can reduce the study population size because we're supplementing with modeling data. We're trying to drive a conversation in that direction to save on clinical trials. So that's an activity that's currently underway.
We have another question.
Sure.
How did you get your data to develop your algorithm? Do you data mine the information from available hospital records?
Another very good question. So, yes, that's one way. Now, the algorithm itself, that we developed, it actually was developed long before I even came to Medtronic. It's been in development for 12 years or so, where in just various simplified, stages, like very targeted studies and in different hardware platforms, very kind of almost science project-y, small scale clinical studies. And it was only like the last 2 years or 3 years that we decided to formalize the development of it and then go forward with this model-based development approach. But so the kind of the first generation algorithm it just kind of evolved over years of incremental clinical studies. Now, that said, the next generation of algorithms that we're working on right now, we are actually mining, say, what you would say like hospital data, and it's actually outpatient because these are not hospital devices. These are use at home everyday devices used by children and adults, and so through our systems we have access to their data and how they use the pump, what kind of performance they're getting out of these systems, and we're able to then use that feedback to do two things. One, tailor these virtual patient models, and also drive design, find out where the problems are with their performance, and drive the next round of innovation with the algorithms.
Thanks, Lou. Does anyone have any further questions? Last call. Everybody loved your presentation, Lou. Thanks. Well,
good. Thank you.
I will wrap this up and thank everyone for attending the webinar, and the link to the recording will be available on the working group's website, and you should receive an email with it as well. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks to Lou, and thanks, Carrie, for running this. Thanks, everybody.